Okay.
Fab. Okay, thank you. So, hi, my name's Emma Forth. I'm a first year history student at the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to use this time today to speak about my project, which looks at the development of early cinema in the United Kingdom from 1909 to 1918. Before I begin, I'd just like to say thanks to the Social History Society for the opportunity to present my work and my initial findings. This is the first time anyone other than my supervisors or my fellow students has seen any of what I've been working on. So it's very much a work in progress, and any and all feedback is very, very welcome. So the period of 1909 to 1918 spans from the passage of the 1909 Cinematograph Act, which regulated the British industry for the first time, to the end of the First World War. This decade saw cinema become the most popular form of commercial mass entertainment in Britain and Ireland. I'm interested in exploring why cinema became such an important leisure practice in British and Irish society, and how the act of cinema going became so quickly embedded within communities both small and large. This era was instrumental in defining the social role of cinema in Britain and Ireland, providing entertainment, employment, and even a vital contribution to the war effort. So my project has three major aims. So firstly, following the boom of 1910, which was the rapid increase in fixed-site cinemas in Britain and Ireland, where were the cinemas located and what types of communities did they serve? Secondly, what social, economic, political, industrial, and religious circumstances enable cinemas to develop or conversely discourage their emergence? And finally, which I think is one of the most important ones for me, is how did the four nations compare in their relationship to cinema? So for the past 7 months, I've been creating the first comprehensive database of British and Irish cinemas in 1914. I'd love to show you my spreadsheets, but they're enormous and I couldn't figure out an easy way to display them on the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to sort of run through the types of data I've been capturing and where I've got it from. So the example I've put on screen here is for the Hippodrome in Bowness, which I've chosen because it's Scotland's oldest cinema. So it's built in 1912 and it's still in operation today. So for the database, I've used two major trade journals, so the Kinematograph Yearbook and then the Bioscope Annual. These publications were aimed at the cinema trade and they contain information on the industry for the production, exhibition and distribution sectors for the previous year. So I'm using the 1915 editions because they're the earliest, most complete years and show the state of the cinema industry at the outbreak of the Great War. These annuals contain information such as where to buy film stock, notable film news, lists of film releases throughout the year, but I'm using the cinema directories, which are sort of a section at the end, which contain lists of all the cinemas in the UK, split into the 4 different nations, plus London. I've been collating all the information for each and every cinema. I began with the Kinematograph Yearbook, recording everything from the name of the cinema to its address, its proprietor, its capacity, its manager, basically anything that's being provided, as you can see sort of in the top left, for the example for Bowness. I've then gone through and cross-referenced with the Bioscope Annual. Sometimes the information matches perfectly, as you can kind of see above, with the Hippodrome appearing in both publications, and with very similar information, but other times I've had to add in additional cinemas, sort of as you can see there with the Coliseum and the Electric Theatre not matching. And then do sort of additional sort of digging around to make sure I've not duplicated cinemas or they've turned up in different countries or anything like that. So it's kind of to make sure that the information is as accurate as it can be using these two sources. So using the information I've had in this database, I've created some kind of preliminary maps to show the geographic locations of 5,145 cinemas. There are 1,350 pins on the map representing these locations. An analysis of the geographic spread of cinemas in this period will be invaluable for directing future avenues of research, so for the coming years of my PhD. I'm now going to go through the maps in a little bit more detail, as the level seen here sort of on the left just confirms cinemas were present in 1914, which isn't particularly helpful or exciting, we just know they were there. So I'm going to focus on each nation in turn, so it's easy to kind of see them in a bit more detail. The screenshots don't really show you the full picture, so if anybody would like a link to the map so you can kind of zoom in and out and have a play with it yourself, then I'm really happy to send that across. So just drop me an email, I'm very happy to do that. So we're going to start with Scotland. So I started with Scotland purely because it's been mapped before as part of the Early Cinema in Scotland project in 2014. So I kind of figured that if my maps ended up looking like theirs, then I was on the right track for the next 3 nations. And they did, which I'm very pleased with. As expected, there are cinemas sort of along the northeast coast and then concentrated along the central belt. I'm very interested in looking at sort of industry in this area, so sort of the Glasgow shipbuilding, and seeing how large populations of, sort of certain workers around different areas would affect cinema attendance in that particular place. And go to England. So as you can see from the image on the left, it's enormous. With nearly 4,000 cinemas, it's quite hard to see anything of use until you zoom sort of right in and you start to see clusters of cinemas in certain places. So London itself had 523 cinemas, which was the most of any single location in the UK, which again was to be expected. But for me, one of the most interesting findings was that the county of Lancashire had more cinemas than London. There are very high numbers across the north, which I find personally quite interesting because I'm from the northwest. I also aim to supplement these kind of statistics with stories of the people behind them where that's possible. I've been a sort of pandemic pen pal with one of my neighbours in Cheshire who, she's in her late 80s and was very excited to tell me all about her late husband's father who owned a cinema in Warrington. After I'd recognised his name as a proprietor, she was very interested to tell me all about that. So any connections like this and sort of anecdotes about individuals, which I do expect I'll hopefully find when I start looking at newspapers and trade papers, they'll hopefully add another dimension to our understanding of cinema in this period. But hopefully that can be sorted by looking definitely at different places. Now I've got ideas of where the cinemas actually are. Moving on to Ireland, there's a more even distribution of cinemas with an obvious concentration around cities of sort of Belfast and Dublin. I was initially concerned that there were large underrepresented areas, but actually it looks like it'll follow population distribution, similar to sort of the lack of cinemas in the Scottish Highlands. I'm interested here to see how political and religious climate in Ireland has impacted how the Irish received cinema at the time. And finally, the last of the four nations, Wales. Again, the geographic spread is what I was anticipating, with cinemas in seaside towns to the north. This will potentially open up questions on tourism and the leisure practices of people on holiday and how seasonal attendance shaped the way in which people visited the cinema. Often the annuals have population figures as well, and here specifically they show them for the summer, indicating there was high enough disparities in seasonal and normal cinema attendance that it merited noting. Also, one of the main interesting things here, which is why I've kind of expanded it as well, is the valleys. So the sheer concentration of cinemas in South Wales is actually really exciting. Scholarship often places Scotland as the biggest sort of cinema-loving nation, whereas my data is showing that there are more cinemas per head in Wales. I'm fascinated to try and work out why. There's obviously migration into the valleys to work on the coal mines, but why are there so many cinemas? Comparisons can be made here to the use of rugby and also the church to foster and develop new communities. But clearly cinema had a really important role to play too in shaping urban and rural society. And then just sort of to wrap everything up, so I'm kind of really brief introduction to my research, but a preliminary sort of geographic analysis of cinema locations has opened up lots of questions and avenues for further inquiry. I very briefly touched upon a few standout points for each individual nation, so sort of industry, religion, tourism, but most of these points are applicable across all four nations. I'm really keen to capture variations across the UK as a whole, with cinemas acting as a lens through which themes of local and national difference and similarity can be explored. At present, I'm currently adding in population figures from the 1911 census to allow for further statistical analysis. And I'll be mapping all of this again, but in GIS software, so I can sort of play around with the data a bit more and hopefully start to look for more patterns beyond the basic geographic as a result. So for instance, I'll be able to see all the locations with just a single cinema or places with more than 50,000 people and be able to depict my initial analysis of counties and regions as well. I'm hoping to look at cinema going in small towns and on the sort of small islands as well and see how that compares to mainland or large cities, and also the role of women as cinema proprietors or managers, as in my database I found that each nation had women in these positions, and it'd be interesting to follow up on that, especially through mentions in trade papers and newspapers. This period demonstrated huge technological and leisure practice modernisation with cinema at its heart, and I'm excited to see how this research can enhance our understanding of the first wave of cinema building and the adoption of cinema going as a regular pastime in Britain and Ireland. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Emma. That was it's so data rich. I love it. It makes my tatty old notebooks kind of look a little less technologically advanced, but it's really great. Thank you very much. Okay, so now are we ready for Grace? You want to? Great,
yeah,
wonderful. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you for having me. And I just, as I'm sharing my screen, I wanted to say how much I've enjoyed all the other panels that I've been able to attend. And I'm looking forward to the plenary tomorrow. So, where are we? Okay. Right, so the title for my paper was advertised as Newsreels or Real News, a case study of wartime newsreels, which was the paper I was scheduled to give in Lancaster this week. But as the presentation that I prepared for that paper involved video clips, and I'd been warned to avoid trying to show film clips on Zoom if I could help it, I decided to save that paper for the rescheduled conference. If we're still online by then, hopefully I will have mastered videos on Zoom. Instead, I've chosen to talk about how living through the COVID-19 pandemic has had a genuine effect on how I'm now interpreting some of my source material relating specifically to the reception of the cinema newsreels in Britain during the Second World War. Like so many of us, in mid-March, our offices were closed and I found myself working from home with an overwhelming feeling of dread and anticipation for what was about to happen. This uncertainty made me seek out television news programming in a way that I had not done pre-COVID-19. Every morning, I would turn on the television and the BBC coronavirus updates would be on in the background for the rest of the day. Nobody was telling me anything new, but I had a sudden need to be sure I wasn't missing any developments. Even when I moved into a house without a television for lockdown, I still actively sought out the news on iPlayer and continued to tune into the daily briefings. Then, one day, I made a conscious decision to stop consuming the news in this way, as I felt it was doing more harm than good. This didn't mean that I no longer cared about the news and the awful number of deaths, but I decided I needed some kind of separation. So this personal experience of how I consume my news in this crisis has made me acutely aware of the importance of the experiences of individuals and made me reassess how I have been thinking about the consumers of cinema newsreels in World War II. Before I go into more detail about this, I'd like to briefly outline what a cinema newsreel was and the place that they held within the news culture of wartime Britain. Newsreel films were short films of around 8 to 10 minutes long, and they were made up of 5 or 6 short news items. These films were shown at cinemas as part of the regular cinema programme before the feature film, or at specialist news theatres which showed a range of newsreels and other short films. In Britain, these newsreels were made by 5 different companies: British Movie Tone News, British Paramount News, British Pathé News, Gaumont British News, and Universal News. And the newsreel that the individual cinema goers would have seen depended on the cinema that they attended. During World War II, these cinema newsreels were the only form of visual news available to civilians on the home front. The government recognised the importance of the medium early on and saw the newsreel as an opportunity to reach and influence the mass audience of British cinema goers. Just to highlight the enormity of this potential audience, the average number of British cinema tickets sold in 1939 was over 19 million, and for all those tickets, a newsreel film would have been included in the programme. The 5 newsreel companies were powerful commercial companies, part of much larger international conglomerates, so it would have been difficult for the Ministry of Information to commandeer a newsreel in the way that had been done in the First World War. It was decided that the companies would still continue to function independently from the government, but military censorship of footage was implemented, and the companies were required to submit any content that they were unsure of to the British Board of Film Censors. The newsreel cameramen were also placed on a rota system where any footage of wartime events had to be pooled for use by all 5 companies. This context of the way the newsreels were produced and censored in wartime is incredibly important, as it shows how the government and the newsreel companies shaped and controlled the news. However, the past few months has highlighted to me how the consumption of that news is equally important, if not more important than the intentions of the producer. How can we as historians clarify the success of propaganda and news programming without establishing how this news was consumed in reality? With this in mind, I'd like to touch on 2 points that have had a particular effect on my work. Firstly, the fact that my own consumption of coronavirus news changed so drastically in just a few months has really made me think about how cinema goers' consumption of wartime news must have continuously fluctuated throughout the period. In addition, I now have much more empathy for those who genuinely didn't want to see any wartime news on their visit to the cinema. Though of course I'd acknowledged this before COVID-19, I couldn't quite fathom the idea that people felt that way. The newsreels and how they showed the wartime events to audiences was so fascinating to me that, to be quite honest, I think a small part of my brain still believed that surely these people wanted to keep themselves updated and that they must have wanted to view wartime events on the screen. However, I now can fully accept that this was not the case for some. I have been viewing those on the home front as a group of people living through the war, when perhaps for many, their only way through it was to live alongside the war, and they didn't want to be reminded of the horrors that they had no control over, particularly in their leisure time. And that's another point. The cinema was a leisure activity. People were there for entertainment, and wartime newsreels were encroaching on that opportunity to go to the cinema for pleasure and to try to switch off from reality. A lot has been written on wartime feature films and criticism from audiences who complained there were too many war films. Now, though the newsreels were a different medium with a different purpose to the feature film, they were still being shown in a place of entertainment, making some people resentful of the fact that they couldn't avoid the news. There were, of course, others who did appreciate the newsreel. In one mass observation report, a cinema goer was recorded as saying that the newsreel was the most important part of the show, and another described it as interest number one. So opinions of the newsreel and whether wartime news had a place in the cinema differed from person to person. And this brings me to my second point, the variety of individual reception to wartime cinema newsreels. There is a tendency to think of news consumers as a mass, and their reception of news is largely considered as a collective reception. This is especially true of cinema audiences. We are inclined to talk of the cinema audience rather than individual cinema goers. Now, as I've already mentioned, the newsreel format appealed to the government because they thought this idea of reaching a mass audience. Now, audience responses at the time, one of the ways that mass observation often reported the levels was by observing the clapping or booing at the appearance of certain figures in the newsreels in order to assess their popularity and gauge audience reception. This method is problematic. Consuming the news in the collective environment of the cinema will inevitably have affected many audience members' reactions to what was on screen. If we jump back to the present day, many people felt uncomfortable clapping for the NHS every Thursday. Obviously, this wasn't because they didn't appreciate the work being done, but some felt that it was virtue signalling, over-politicised, and sadly an empty gesture while there is still a lack of PPE in hospitals. However, most people continue to come to their doorsteps despite these reservations, partly in fear of judgment from their local community. Many of those in the cinema during World War II may have joined in with the cheering and booing for similar reasons, especially as during the war people were suspicious of odd behaviour. Perhaps being the only person in the audience not cheering for the Prime Minister or booing at Nazi officials would have encouraged more than a few funny looks. In conclusion, the current pandemic has made me consider how the reception of wartime newsreels is just as important as the control of production. It has also forced me to reconsider the importance of the individual in mass news consumption. When I began my research, I was committed to telling the stories of the individuals involved in the production process, the cinema exhibition industry, and the cinema goers themselves. Living through this moment has reminded me of my original motivations and refocused my attentions. As a doctoral student, it has also reminded me of the importance of not trying to use source material to serve the purpose that I want it to. If some people chose not to consume the newsreels in World War II, then that is just as important as how the way newsreels portrayed the war affected those who did. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was really interesting. I certainly saw a lot of my own kind of news consumption behaviours in that talk lately. So that's very, very poignant, I think. Thank you. So now we're just going to move on to Talita as our last speaker in this section. If you're ready, Talita.
Yes, I'll share my screen with you.
Thank you.
Just 1 second. It is okay?
Perfect.
Okay, I prepared a text as well because I was worried about my time and to be more secure about my English as well. I hope you can understand me. It is a pleasure to be here to participate in this event. I would like to congratulate the organization of the Congress and also the fact that it turned into a virtual event. My name is Talita. I currently hold the PhD Social Communication at Federal University of Juiz de Fora here in Brazil, in the research media line Media Competence, Aesthetics and Temporality. And I'm also an associate researcher of a research group called Communication, City and Memory. Although my research is with the communicational all my research passes by the history because of what I have to do to rescue the history of Intervalo magazine. The article that I submitted to the conference is titled, "The Past of the Brazilian Press, the Rescue of the History of Intervalo magazine through the Oral History Methodology." This work is a brief report on how I managed by conducting the interviews using the oral history methodology to regain the memory and history of the magazine Intervalo. The research with the magazine Intervalo started during my master's degree, which has as a main research guide the study about the third Brazilian popular musical festival of 1967, and how it was narrated and portrayed by the Brazilian press, especially magazines. Historically, the 60s and 70s were of great social, political, cultural, and artistic effervescence throughout the world. In Brazil, it wasn't different. Despite being under a control of the military, our country saw sprouting during these decades various artistic and musical movements, which gained adherents throughout the national territory, thanks to the space dedicated to them in all media, especially television and magazines that talked about TV. The biggest motivation in turning Intervalo into my object of analysis was the fact that I didn't find any academic papers or books that talked about it. Thus, I identified beyond its originality the possibility not only analyzing it, but also rescue its long-lost history. The challenge inspired me, and I went after the reconstruction of the magazine's memory. Intervalo magazine is considered one of the most important specialized publications that emerged between the 60s and 70s here in Brazil, as it valued its entirety television subjects and created a new way of communicating and relating toward the media. Very attentive to the national and international media market, Victor Chivita's inspiration for the launch of Intervalo came from the United States, from one of the most famous magazines of the time, called TV Guide, a small format publication which contained all television programs covering the North America continent from coast to coast and all TV stations. More than bringing the TV programming, Intervalo came up with the intention of treating in a journalistic way the issues that were on the television. Thus, the magazine built a very close relationship with Brazilian TV and changed its way of communication as television has also evolved. since the creation of new programs, new communication strategies, soap operas, journalism, among others. The reconstruction of the memory of Magazine Intervalo, I could do this because I used the oral history methodology with Abril's staff and journalists who work for Intervalo. Consulting the digitalized collection of the National Library allowed me to locate a source through the magazines that directed me to other sources. At the initial interviews, some names were cited by the interviewees, and this gave us a new direction, which resulted in 2 more recordings. So far, 12 people have been interviewed, and we have gathered over 300 pages of transcripts and 23 hours of audio and image recording. By collecting these statements, we were able, among other things, to retrieve the history of Intervalo magazine. One of the advantages was to be able to interview people from different periods and phases of the magazine, as well from different areas from the newsroom, further expanding the vision and the historiographic dimension of our research. Given the wealth of information we gained from the interviews, I kept the doctoral research proposal to conduct a few more interviews to further investigate how the relationship was built between Intervalo magazine and the Brazilian television, and to what extent this relationship dictated the contents that went to the weekly pages. Throughout the studies about memory, as well as the use of the oral history methodology, we realized that history is unique and therefore has its value and deserves to be preserved and experienced. The use of historical narratives is part of our daily lives and deserves to be kept for future generations, and those statements that have social meaning must be appropriated by the society so that they could collaborate for a new social memory, because once they are articulated, the narratives wave a new social and plural memory. The recovery of the history of Intervalo made evident the revelation and the understanding of new perspectives and interpretations about a historical period that has been much studied here in Brazil, but that have strands and untold stories that, once shared, provide a new reframing of ideas about the past. Furthermore, this was the only method to make it's possible to rescue and recover the magazine's history, as well as its characteristics. This research is still ongoing and intends to analyze the testimonies under different aspects, from the journal's relationship with the media to its context in a military period, its production characteristics, curiosities, and singularities. We were able to prove in this article that Editora Abril, weekly print, had great importance in the print market at the time, but also in the television media that built a very close and loyal relationship over the years. In the time that television has evolved and changed, the magazine has followed these changes and improvements, always massively disseminating TV programs, singers, stars, and celebrities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, there I am. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I love the visual nature of this presentation. It's just so good to see so many images. Yeah, it's lovely. So, as I've already said, my name is Edda Nicolson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wolverhampton. My paper is called Manifestations of Warmth, Emotions in Trade Unionism. And this is based on a case study that I'm doing in my thesis on one particular meeting of the General Federation of Trade Unions. May I ask the delegate if he has any charge to make against the Gas Workers Union to make it definitely? At the present moment, I am the chairman of the whole of the organisations in this federation. If necessary, however, I will defend my own society." So warned Pete Curran as he presided over the 1909 annual council meeting of the General Federation of Trade Unions. The GFTU were founded in 1899 to act as the economic arm of the trade union movement. Their main role was to act as a strike fund during industrial disputes. So the National Dyers representative, Alfred Heaton, had said that certain societies were continually trespassing upon the trades of organisations. So despite this veiled language, Curran clearly took this as a personal accusation that his union had been poaching members. Now, known as likeable and jovial, Curran had been chairman of the GFTU since their inception, but he was also known for his fiery temper, particularly after having had a drink. This meeting was only a couple of months since his 10-shilling fine for being drunk and incapable in the street, and only a year before his early death of cirrhosis of the liver. But I find the role of personality and the idea of emotional undercurrents in trade unions really interesting. Verbatim reports, such as this one, were designed to appear open and transparent, but it's clear that there were strong feelings lurking underneath. Although uncommon, the idea of looking at emotions in the British labour movement is not new. In fact, E.P. Thompson is clear that a person must feel their class through their shared common experiences. Emotions have been kept in the background of scholarship, though, which probably has something to do with traditional labour historiography, assuming that emotions are some sort of rationality kryptonite. As Rob Boddice suggests, efforts to bring working class history out from the shadows of great kings and noble men during the 20th century brought with it the need to make it sensible, appropriate, and acceptable. But as Carol and Peter Stearns noted, emotional does not equal irrational. In fact, emotions work in and around reasoning, and vice versa. So I think this is crucial. The emotional undercurrents that produced or destroyed solidarity flows right through the successes and the failures of early 20th century trade unionism. So there are several other hostile flourishes, like the one between Heaton and Curran, that I don't really have time for today. But another emotional moment I want to tell you about relates more to friendships. So during the discussion about raising the salary of the General Secretary William Appleton, it transpired that he had been expelled by his own union only a few months before. The report now suddenly becomes vague and they stop naming the speakers, but delegates voiced concern and surprise and questions of confidence. Could a man be in charge of the General Federation of Trade Unions that represented 700,000 workers at this point, be in charge but not necessarily belong to his own union? Finally, C. Wardle, the delegate from the Nottingham lacemakers, confirmed Appleton's expulsion for wrongdoing, but said it would be inadvisable for him to give details to the conference. So the man that was responsible for Appleton's expulsion was sitting there in the meeting there. When questioned directly, Appleton, not so cryptically, told the conference that when he knew he had enemies, he also remembered that he had friends, and that now he was a fully paid-up member of the Scottish Lacemakers Society. The potential embarrassment of having a non-affiliated General Secretary was hurriedly resolved through a helpful dose of opaque minute-taking, but it really speaks to the idea of a hidden friendship network that underpins the interrelation required to build a federation, as much as the arguments and the hostility at the meeting also highlight the potential frailty and fragility of those networks. At a more macro level, I want to argue also that there is an emotional rule book embedded in the culture of trade unions. The GFTU at this time had 120 affiliated societies, which brought together really disparate ideologies that ranged from ardent liberalism to full-throttle revolutionary socialism. So forming and maintaining unity required rules of conduct, which went beyond the usual social norms and developed into a culture of emotional acceptability. No rallying cries for a guillotine, because working class anger had been regulated and tempered in order to create the election of committees and subcommittees and tabling and drafting of motions. As such, individual delegates gathered to create or express collective feelings. One man expressed deepest regret over their treasurer's illness, who then called for the sympathy of the whole conference to go out to him. and that the conference move that a letter of sympathy be sent from this federation to express their feelings. This collective expression of sympathy through a formal communication was then voted on and agreed to unanimously, as if the feeling of sympathy had to be legitimized and formalized within the paperwork-driven machine of trade union culture. There was a moral pressure to vote for official sympathy, which resulted in a unanimous motion. So another culture framework is that of family. Delegates frequently refer to each other as brother. The GFTU at this point had a very uneasy relationship with women trade unionists, and it's pretty doubtful that Mary MacArthur appreciated being referred to as a brother when she was in these meetings, but I'm afraid that's for another paper. Also, there is a situation of the GFTU within the labour movement family as a whole. So they were created in 1899 by the TUC at their Manchester conference, but from day one they were fully autonomous and still regarded the TUC as like a parent body. So for this meeting, the TUC sent David Shackleton as their representative, and he referred to himself as president of the mother body of the organised workers, and that as the GFTU was one of their children, they were pleased to see it growing in strength and usefulness. As with all parent-child relationships, there can be strain as well as nurture, and the GFTU's stubborn teenager phase was yet to come, but again, I'm afraid that's for another paper. As we all know, and undoubtedly miss, there is an important social element to conferences. Now, the night before this particular conference, a few members of the management committee of the GFTU hosted a retirement dinner for Thomas Ashton. He'd been a trade unionist for 50 years, so he was very well known and very well liked. And the important part about that is that they actually invited the minute taker to come to their night out and to take minutes, and they put those minutes into the annual report. And it sort of underlines the sort of importance of that kind of social connection that they have. But aside from Thomas Ashton, the guest of honour was Samuel Gompers. He was the president of the American Federation of Labour. And he was well liked by a lot of people, but the most enthusiastic praise for Gompers came from William Appleton. He was the one that was suspended from the Nottingham Lacemakers. He said, their feelings towards Mr. Gompers were something more than mere admiration, and that they loved him for himself, as well as his work as a trade unionist. And he ended his speech by saying, it was because of the admiration and the love he felt towards him that he asked them to drink to the health of the American Federation and Samuel Gompers. William Appleton and Samuel Gompers would be friends for many years. So I'll just end my, my paper with how Curran ended the conference. And he declared that apart from one or two slight manifestations of warmth, the conference had been the best conference that they have had. I would argue that the warmth Curran didn't really like very much was a key part of how the GFTU brought together such a variety of organisations in search of a common cause. Regulating working class emotions, particularly anger and solidarity, is a crucial part of how trade unions operated. There had to be emotional jostling, feelings of annoyance and pride, acceptance and anger, in order for delegates to voice the opinions and the concerns of their own unions. That they did so with a specific emotional rulebook and an implied framework of acceptability designed by their specific trade union culture highlights the crucial role that collective emotions played at the GFTU. Thank you. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's got a recorded presentation for us.
Yep. Hi, so I'm Matt. I'm an Exeter PhD student in my second year. My paper is looking at memory and temporality during conversations of industrial decline through a case study of the Isle of Sheppey. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have pre-made an audio to play, so I'll play that now. Hello everyone, and thank you for letting me speak today. I'll be speaking about a chapter that forms, or my preliminary research on a chapter that forms part of my PhD thesis. So my thesis is examining the impact of deindustrialisation on popular perceptions of work, place and belonging in England since the 1960s through a comparative study of two rather different places and temporal circumstances, Tyneside in the northeast and the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. Now, the paper I'll give today is very early thoughts on the methodological potential and challenges when working with different oral history collections that capture memory of a similar topic, and I'll speak about that in relation to my opening chapter of the Sheppey case study. Now, on face value, the Isle of Sheppey, which is a 36-mile island located off the North Kent coast, may not appear to be a place to focus the study of deindustrialisation. Its geographical location in the Garden of England is removed from popular understandings of deindustrialisation as a process confined to the English north and industrial regions of Scotland and Wales. Yet Sheppey deindustrialised early when compared to these industrial heartlands. The Royal Naval Dockyard, located at the heart of the island's principal town, Sheerness, that has dominated male employment on the island since the late 17th century, closed in 1960. A study of the Isle of Sheppey reminds us that industrial change in late 20th century England impacted upon more geographically diverse and widespread areas than is commonly acknowledged. So the first chapter of my Sheppey case study seeks to unpack memory around the dockyard and its closure by putting into conversation two oral history projects. The first of these was conducted in 1980 with 8 former workers as part of the initial phase of Ray Parl's pioneering sociological research on Sheppey. The second is 33 interviews done in 2010 as part of Dawn Line and Graham Crow's Living and Working on Sheppey project. Now, I don't have time to unpack the full details of these two oral history collections, but the most sort of salient point to bear in mind is that those interviewed in both collections were extremely old. In the 1980 collection, all the interviewees were retired workers born at the turn of the 20th century, and they retired either just before the closure or they'd reached retirement age at the point of closure. Now, the choice to interview only older retirees has important implications for what sort of memories are recalled, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Now, I would have loved to explore the feelings and memories of those workers in the middle of their working life who lost their dockyard jobs, but these just sadly weren't captured in 1980, and it's not in 2010. They weren't able to be captured either due to the amount of time that had passed. In the 2010 interviews, only older people could have been interviewed, and this was the only way to capture any sort of memory of working in Sheerness Dockyard, and this was normally with individuals who'd only worked for a very short amount of time anyway. While the closure of the Sheerness Dockyard and the meanings of this are important to me, they're not really the sole or even principal aim of either collection. So the 1980 collection was more concerned with reconstructing a lost occupational community. In part, this was one of the outcomes of only interviewing really old individuals, whereas in the 2010 interviews, the dockyard was part of a broader framework of understanding what it was like to live and work on 21st century Sheppey. So here there are tensions between the aims and interests of the researcher doing secondary analysis, in this case me, and the original purpose of the data collectors. But one of the good things about secondary analysis of archived oral history interviews is that we can uncover unanticipated historical insights and a deeper understanding of our subjects. Indeed, by reading these interviews against the grain, the closure of the dockyard can be reconsidered as the central marker of the interview in its importance to individual constructions of narrative. What we uncover is how the interviews shape their own presence in two different moments after the closure of Sheerness Dockyard, one after 20 years and the other after 50 years. So if anything, the chapter is primarily a study of how memory and narrative and significance of the closure of Sheerness Dockyard existed and was shaped by the specific historical context of 1980 and 2010. Now, in studies of industrial decline, the notion of collective memory still holds significant importance. Deindustrialisation studies often conceptualises memory in the context of wider frameworks, mainly the workplace and community, and how they structure the remembering of events. But even those who are sympathetic to the idea of collective memory have argued that historians should not only unpack the narrative offered in oral history, but also contextualise the meaning that is individually invested in shared narratives. So building on this, the chapter thinks about what interviewees perceive to be collective memories or wider popular representations of the past. And these are often constructed through a dialogue between past and present in the interview themselves. So broadly speaking, the collective memory that manifests itself around the closure of Sheerness Dockyard is rather bleak. It was seen as the trigger that disrupted a rather stable, traditional working class community that was subsequently abandoned and left with poorly paid, insecure jobs. Yet, the oral historian Anna Green has argued that the oral testimony on Sheppey really reveals that sort of individual memory often challenged collective accounts. So as an example, John King in 1980 said that when the dockyard closed, everyone thought, this is the end of the road. But he actually saw it as what he called a godsend, because the local economy diversifies into multiple, albeit low-paid industries. So by uniquely having access to two oral history collections that were done at very different moments, but touching on the same historical process, it's possible to examine individual recollections both on their own terms, but while also paying attention to the influence of wider narratives on memory. Rather than say that these two are necessarily oppositional and mutually exclusive, the chapter unpicks how individual memories, though often independent and resistant to wider collective frameworks, were at the same time integral to any collective memory of the closure of Sheerness Dockyard that was in circulation in either 1980 or 2010, i.e. the individual memory only really had any salience because it argued against the narrative that was being constructed as more of a wider understanding. Moreover, what the two sources illuminate is the temporality of the memories at different moments in time. So in 1980, the closure is part of what's understood as a linear trajectory of time that, while often fraught and uncertain, is understood through an organising narrative around progress or modernisation. Now, whether they agreed with this progress is another matter, however, and we can talk about that in questions maybe. On the other hand, the 2010 interviews understood the closure as either a secular conception of time, rooted in people's experience of observing recurring episodes of industrial decline, both locally on Sheppey and also nationally through the later part of the 20th century, or they saw it as a point of narrative foreclosure that individuals struggled to exert agency or control over. They prepared themselves very early on for a lifetime in the dockyard that never happened. Now, when working with oral history, historians often have to account for the extent to which events since the topic we're looking into throw shade over individual memory of the time being recollected. But what's most striking for this study is how the process appears to work in reverse. Now, in 1980, interviews really recall the difficulties of the 1920s and 30s, and they used the memory of that time to relativize the post-closure story as less fraught and challenging than the interwar years. In 2010, interviews often talk about the dynamism of everyday life through sounds and smells, but in the immediate post-war years. But then they talk about the stillness of island life after the closure, i.e. from 1960 onwards. So overall, the aim of the chapter is to explore how individual constructions of perceived collective memories is constantly revised over time in search of personal meaning. The differences, and indeed the similarities in experience and memories as they were recalled in 1980 and 2010, show that social and cultural impacts of major localized industrial decline is a process that's continuously reworked through accommodating memory to new context. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was really interesting. I do love the topic of deindustrialization. I think it's fascinating for me. I'm going to jump straight in and just have my privilege as a chair because I can. I just wanted to ask Matt. You described obviously the whole topic of deindustrialization and the effect that it has on communities. It's very bleak. I think you used the word bleak, and I'm curious. Like when you these interviews, like, do people want to remember? Like, are they keen to have these stories told, or is it quite painful for them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think they are, and I think this is where the whole collective versus individual comes into quite sort of interesting conflict, that they like to create this kind of collective memory of how bleak it was, but they always like to put their own personal twist and show their own sort of individuality about how sort of they were a lucky one, that they were able to get a good job afterwards, but the island has gone downhill. So the difficulty is really where they think sort of other people or broader narratives are being constructed. But it is quite strange that largely their own experiences they want to see as almost relatively okay. They do obviously talk about sort of a sense of loss around sort of industry and what it meant to come from a certain place. But yeah, they're still not sort of overwhelmingly nostalgic on in one way, and also not really sort of talking down what's happened since sort of overall. They do actually have their own individual sort of personal, which is slightly more, don't know, they're not exactly sort of like overwhelmingly, oh, it's all great, but yeah, it is interesting.
It's very human, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to our speakers for our last Social History Society panel. It's been really interesting to hear about all of your work, and thank you so much for making my job really easy. You all just kept perfectly to time. It was just like we rehearsed. It was great. So thank you again, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow in the plenary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.